The silver shackles bit into Alara's wrists, the cold metal singing a song of betrayal that burned hotter than the brand on her shoulder. Rain lashed against the mud-slicked clearing of the neutral grounds, blurring the faces of the three women she had called sisters since their mother's death. But she didn't need to see their eyes to know the ice residing there. The debt is paid, Lyra's voice, the eldest, the one who had tucked Alara into bed for 19 years, cut through the thunder. There was no tremor in her tone, only the flat, metallic click of a business transaction finalized. Across the clearing, the Shadow Gully alphas, men who smelled of wet fur and old blood, grinned. Their eyes, glowing a predatory amber, raked over Alara not as a person, but as a piece of meat, a bargaining chip traded for a border treaty and a chest of enchanted gold. She's a Spitfire, the lead alpha, a man with a jagged scar across his throat named Silas Vane, growled. He stepped forward, his hand heavy and callous as it gripped Alara's jaw, forcing her to look at the sisters who had just signed her death warrant. Are you sure you want to let such a rare thing go? She was never one of us, her middle sister, Katniss Lundegard, spat, shielding the gold from the rain. She's a mouth to feed and a liability. Take her. Before we change the price. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The betrayal was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure that made the oxygen in the clearing feel thin. She wanted to scream, to beg, to remind them of the winters they had survived together, huddled for warmth. But the words died in a throat parched by shock. As Silas jerked the silver chain, dragging her toward the dark tree-line of the enemy territory, Alara realized with a soul-crushing clarity, she wasn't being sent to a new home. She was being sent to a slaughterhouse. Before we go any further into this heart-wrenching journey of betrayal and destiny, I want to say a huge hello to all of you joining us today. Whether you're listening in from the rainy streets of London, the sun-drenched hills of Brazil, or tucked away in a quiet corner of the States, how are you all doing today? My heart is truly with Alara in this moment, and I know yours is too. If you haven't already, please consider hitting that subscribe button and joining our community. Your support is the heartbeat of these stories, and we have so much more to uncover together. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. I love reading your stories as much as I love sharing mine. The forest swallowed her. The scent of her sister's lavender perfume was replaced by the cloying, metallic stench of the Shadow Gully Pack's camp. Every snap of a twig felt like a bone breaking. Silas leaned close to her ear, his breath hot and smelling of raw elk. You think we bought you for breeding little wolf blood? He hissed, his laughter a jagged thing. The High King of the Night is demanding a tribute. A sacrifice to keep his thirst away from our borders. You aren't our prize, Alara. You're our shield. We're delivering you to the Citadel of Cinders tonight. Alara froze. The Citadel. The seat of the Vampire King. A creature of myth and nightmare who hadn't been seen in the light of the moon for a century. They weren't just enslaving her. They were feeding her to the god of death himself. As they reached the iron gates of the King's Mountain Pass, the air suddenly turned frigid. The wolves around her began to whimper, their bravado vanishing in the presence of something ancient, something apex. A shadow detached itself from the monolithic stone pillars, a figure draped in midnight silk, eyes like dying stars. The Vampire King stepped into the faint moonlight. He didn't look at the alphas. He didn't look at the gold. His gaze locked onto Alara, and for the first time in her life, the silver shackles on her wrists didn't feel like the heaviest thing she was wearing. It was the sudden violent pull in her chest, a tether of golden light only she could see, snapping into place between her soul and the monster before her. What is this? The king's voice vibrated through the very marrow of her bones. A gift, your majesty. Silas stammered, shoving Alara forward so hard she fell to her knees at the king's boots. A peace offering. The king reached out, his long, pale fingers hovering just inches from Alara's throat. The air hissed. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble. He didn't smell like death. He smelled like winter cedar and the first breath of a storm. You brought me a gift? The king whispered, his eyes turning a deep, predatory crimson as he sensed the heartbeat thundering in Alara's neck. You fools. You didn't bring me a slave. He looked down at Alara, and in that moment she saw not a monster, but a reflection of her own shattered soul. You brought me my queen. How could her sisters have been so blind? And what happens when the most feared man in the world realizes his fated mate has been bruised and sold like common cattle? The Vampire King, known to the underworld as Caspian Torrents, did not move with the haste of a man. He moved with the inevitable grace of a shifting glacier. He ignored the whimpering alphas, his focus narrowed entirely on Alara. With a flick of his wrist, the silver shackles that had been chafing her skin didn't just unlock. They disintegrated into fine gray ash. Alara stayed on her knees, her breath hitching. She had spent her life as the runt of the Silvermoon Pack, the sister who cooked the meals and mended the tunics while Lyra and Katniss trained for war. Her deepest desire had always been simple: to belong. To be seen as a person, not a servant. But as she looked up into Caspian's piercing starlight eyes, she realized her greatest fear was coming true. She was being seen, but by someone who could unmake her with a single thought. "Stand," Caspian commanded. It wasn't a cruel order, but the authority in his voice was like a physical hand lifting her up. Alara stood, her legs trembling. She was small compared to him, a creature of warmth and pulse standing before a monument of ice and shadow. Her internal compass, usually so attuned to the safety of the woods, was spinning wildly. Every instinct told her to run, yet the tether, that invisible shimmering cord connecting their hearts, throbbed with a strange magnetic heat. It felt like coming home to a house she had never visited. "My name is Alara," she whispered, her voice cracking. She had to say it. She had to reclaim her identity before it was swallowed by the darkness of the citadel. "Alara Stacy. I am not a gift. I was stolen." Caspian's jaw tightened, a muscle leaping in his pale cheek. He turned his gaze toward Silas Vane, who was now backing away, his tail literally tucked between his legs. "You sold her," Caspian said softly. It was a sound more terrifying than a roar. "You put iron on the skin of a fated mate. You treated the soul of the night like a ledger entry." "We didn't know." Silas shrieked, his amber eyes wide with terror. "Her sisters, the ones from the north, they said she was nothing. They said she was a discard." At the mention of her sisters, Alara felt a fresh wave of agony. Lyra had promised their dying mother she would protect Alara. Katniss had laughed with her just 2 nights ago over a shared bowl of stew. The betrayal wasn't just a business move. It was a surgical removal of her heart. She realized now that they hadn't just sold her for gold. They had sold her because her presence was a constant reminder of the morality they were willing to sacrifice for power. "Leave the gold," Caspian directed his guards, 2 towering vampires in obsidian armor named Bastion and Lucius. "And tell the Shadow Gully pack that their borders are no longer recognized. By sunrise they are prey." As the wolves fled into the night, Caspian turned back to Alara. He reached out, his thumb grazing the bruise on her jaw where Silas had gripped her. His touch was cold, yes, but it didn't bite. Felt like silk. "You have been discarded by the small-minded," Caspian murmured, his voice dropping to a register that only she could hear. "But in this kingdom you are the apex. You are the heartbeat of the mountain. Do you understand what you are to me, Alara Stacy?" Alara looked at the massive Gothic spires of the citadel rising behind him. It was a place of secrets, a fortress built on the blood of enemies. She was a girl who liked the smell of rain on grass and the quiet of a library. He was a king who ruled through fear and ancient law. "I understand that I am a prisoner of a different kind," she said, her spark of defiance flickering back to life. Caspian's lips curved into a ghost of a smile, the first sign of humanity she had seen in him. "A prisoner? Oh, a queen in transition. Your sisters think they have pruned a weak branch from their tree. They don't realize they've planted a forest that will eventually consume them." He offered his arm. It was a gesture of profound respect, one she had never received from her own kin. As they began the long walk up the winding stone stairs, Alara felt the weight of the citadel's history pressing down on her. She caught glimpses of the king's inner circle, vampires who had lived for centuries, watching her with a mix of awe and hunger. She saw Isabella, Caspian's high priestess, whose eyes held the wisdom of 1,000 moons, and Dmitri, the general of the Night Guard, a man who looked like he could crush a boulder with his bare hands. They didn't see a helpless girl, they saw the missing piece of their king's power. But as Alara looked back at the dark forest where her sisters were likely celebrating their newfound wealth, a cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. The vulnerability she had felt in the clearing was hardening into something else. Revenge was a dark path, but as the golden tether to the Vampire King pulsed in time with her own heart, she realized she now had the ultimate weapon to walk it. The velvet silence of the citadel was shattered not by a scream, but by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a battering ram against the southern postern. Ilara bolted upright in the massive four-poster bed, the silk sheets sliding off her skin like water. It had been 3 days since Caspian had brought her into his sanctuary, 3 days of gold-leafed isolation and the strange magnetic pull of a king who watched her with a hunger that wasn't just for blood. Ilara. The heavy oak door groaned open and Caspian stepped inside. He wasn't the composed monarch she had seen in the moonlight. His obsidian armor was dusted with snow, and his eyes were a terrifying, glowing crimson. Get up. Now. What's happening? Ilara's heart hammered. Is it the pack? Did they come for me? Caspian reached her in a blur of motion, his hands catching her shoulders. The fated mate bond flared between them, a surge of protective electricity that made her gasp. Worse. Your sisters didn't just sell you to the Shadow Gully wolves, Ilara. They played a double game. They sold the coordinates of the Citadel's sunshield anchors to the High Alpha of the Northern Wastes. They've brought a war to my doorstep to cover their tracks. The air in the room suddenly felt like ice. Her sisters, Lyra and Katniss, hadn't just discarded her. They were trying to annihilate the only place she was safe. If the sunshield anchors fell, the midday sun would turn the citadel into a tomb of ash for Caspian and his people. They're here for the gold, aren't they? Ilara whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted the Vampire King's treasury, and they used me as the bait to find the way in. They are already through the first perimeter, Caspian growled, his fangs lengthening. My general, Dmitri Corvin, is holding the courtyard, but the wolves are using silver-tipped incendiaries. They aren't here to capture you, Ilara. They're here to burn everything you touch. A massive explosion rocked the tower, sending a chandelier crashing to the floor in a spray of crystal. Through the arched window, Ilara saw the horizon glowing a sickly orange. The forest she had once called home was being trampled by a legion of wolves, thousands of them, led by a banner she recognized all too well. The Silver Moon crest. Her own family's flag. I have to go down there, Ilara said, her voice steadying with a sudden, fierce resolve. No, Caspian countered, his grip tightening. You are the heartbeat of this mountain. If you die, my soul withers. I will hide you in the crypts. They are my sisters, Caspian. Ilara stepped into his space, her hand resting on the cold metal of his breastplate. The golden tether between them hummed with an urgent frequency. They know my scent. They know how I think. If you hide me, they will hunt every inch of this castle until they find me, and they'll kill anyone in their way. But if I face them... You are a human among monsters, he hissed, though his eyes softened with a desperate admiration. I am your mate, she corrected, the words tasting like a vow. And if you are the king of the night, then let them see what happens when they touch what belongs to the shadows. Caspian stared at her, the predator within him warring with the man who had waited centuries for her. Finally he reached into his tunic and pulled out a dagger. The hilt was carved from dragon bone, the blade a shimmering dark steel that seemed to drink the light. This is Nightfall, he whispered, pressing the weapon into her hands. It was forged in the blood of the first king. It does not miss. It does not forgive. But before they could move toward the door, the wall of the bedchamber exploded inward. Dust and stone flew like shrapnel. Through the settling debris stepped a figure Ilara knew better than her own reflection. It was Lyra. But she wasn't the sister who had brushed Ilara's hair. She was draped in tactical leather, her eyes glowing with a chemical artificial gold. The mark of a werewolf who had taken the Ascension Serum, a forbidden drug that granted godlike strength at the cost of one's humanity. Behind her stood Katniss, holding a crossbow leveled directly at Caspian's heart. Look at you, Lyra sneered, stepping over the rubble. From a scullery made to a vampire's pet. We knew you'd lead us right to him, Ilara. The fated mate legend is such a predictable weakness. You used me, Ilara breathed, the dagger heavy in her hand. You sold me knowing he would take me in. You used our bond as a GPS for your invasion. Business is business, little sister, Katniss said, her finger tightening on the trigger. The Vampire King falls tonight and the Silver Moon Pack inherits the night. Now move away from him, or we'll see if a fated mate's heart bleeds the same color as ours. In that moment the choice was made. The inciting incident hadn't just been the betrayal in the clearing, it was the realization that her bloodline was her greatest enemy. Alara didn't move away. She stepped in front of Caspian, the tiny human shielding the god of death. "You want the king?" Alara's voice rang out, cold and sharp as the blade in her hand. "You'll have to go through the queen first." The air in the bedchamber crackled with the static of unsheathed magic and the musk of apex predators. Lyra took a predatory step forward, her claws extending, scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a whetstone on steel. "You..." "The queen." Lyra laughed, a jagged, hollow sound. "You were always the girl who cried over broken bird wings, Alara. You don't have the stomach for this throne." "I have the stomach for what you made me," Alara countered, her grip on Nightfall white-knuckled. Before Lyra could lunge, Caspian moved. He didn't strike. He became a blur of shadow, intercepting Katniss just as she pulled the trigger of her crossbow. The silver bolt hissed through the air, missing Caspian's throat by a hair's breadth and burying itself in the headboard of the bed. With a roar of primal fury, Caspian threw Katniss against the far wall, the impact cracking the stone. "Go!" Caspian shouted to Alara, his fangs fully extended, his face a mask of terrifying, demonic beauty. "Get to the Great Hall. Dimitri needs the Queen's seal to activate the mountain's internal defenses. I'll handle the traitors." Alara didn't hesitate. She bolted through the ruined wall, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone of the corridor. Behind her, the sounds of a supernatural hurricane erupted. The crashing of furniture, the snarls of wolves, and the bone-chilling hiss of a vampire king unleashed. The citadel was a labyrinth of chaos. As Alara sprinted through the vaulted hallways, she saw the true scale of the invasion. Shadow Gully wolves and Silvermoon warriors were swarming the lower levels, clashing with Caspian's night guard. The scent of ozone and copper was suffocating. She rounded a corner and nearly collided with Dmitri Corvin, the general. His obsidian armor was slick with dark ichor and his breathing was heavy. "High Queen!" he gasped, spinning his heavy claymore to decapitate a wolf lunging from the shadows. "The sunshield anchors in the west wing are failing. If they drop, the dawn will incinerate us all." "Where is the seal?" Alara demanded, the urgency clawing at her throat. "The solar chamber. But it's been compromised." Dmitri pointed toward a spiral staircase choked with smoke. "A splinter cell of your sister's elite guard has barricaded the entrance. They're trying to manual override the shutters to let the light in." Alara felt a cold sweat break across her skin. It wasn't just about a throne anymore. It was about the survival of every soul in this mountain. As she climbed the stairs, she encountered the first of her obstacles. Silas Vane. The alpha who had bought her in the clearing was standing guard at the solar chamber door, his eyes bloodshot and crazed from the ascension serum. Well, Silas growled, his muscles bulging unnaturally beneath his skin. "The little runaway. I'm going to enjoy breaking you properly this time." Alara didn't back down. She channeled the heat of the fated mate bond, the golden tether that felt like a sun burning in her chest. She realized then that the bond wasn't just a romantic connection. It was a conduit of power. She felt Caspian's strength, his centuries of combat instinct, flowing into her limbs. As Silas lunged, Alara didn't flinch. She ducked beneath his massive swipe, the world slowing down in a blur of adrenaline. She drove the dragon-bone dagger into his thigh, twisting the blade. Silas roared in agony, but as he reached for her throat, a silver-tipped arrow sprouted from his shoulder. Alara spun around to see a young vampire she hadn't met before, Seraphina Valerius, a scout with eyes like polished emeralds. "The king sent word." Seraphina shouted, notched another arrow. "We hold the stairs, you get to the seal." But as Alara reached the door to the solar chamber, a new doubt crept in. Was she being led into another trap? Among the chaos, she saw a discarded missive on the floor, bearing the Silvermoon seal. She snatched it up, her eyes scanning the scrawled handwriting of her middle sister, Katniss. "Once the king is distracted by the girl, trigger the collapse. We don't need the gold. We need the extinction." The realization was a jagged blade to the heart. Her sisters didn't just want power. They wanted to commit genocide against the vampire race, and they were using Alara as the ultimate distraction. Every moment she spent falling in love or finding her place, was a moment they used to plant explosives at the mountain's foundations. Tension coiled in her gut like a serpent. She was caught between a king who saw her as his soul and a family that saw her as a detonator. She burst into the solar chamber, only to find the room bathed in the eerie pre-dawn light of the mountain's failing magical barriers. Standing by the central mechanism was a figure she hadn't expected. Not a wolf, but a man in a high-collared coat, Julian Blackwood, a rogue vampire who had been Caspian's advisor for decades. He held the queen's seal in his hand, his face a mask of cold calculation. "You're working with them?" Elara breathed, the dagger trembling in her hand. "Caspian is blinded by you, Elara," Julian said softly. "The world is changing. The wolves offer a treaty that ensures our survival in exchange for his head. I'm simply choosing the side that lives." The stakes were at their absolute ceiling. If Elara couldn't get the seal, the sun would rise and Caspian would die. If she killed Julian, she might trigger the very collapse her sisters had planned. The solar chamber felt like the inside of a dying star. The massive gears of the mountain's sunshield ground against one another with a shriek of protesting metal. And through the reinforced glass of the dome, the horizon was beginning to bleed a pale, ghostly gray. The dawn was coming, and with it the extinction of the citadel. "Give me the seal, Julian," Elara said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. The golden tether in her chest was no longer just a hum. It was a physical ache, a thundering pulse that mirrored Caspian's own heartbeat. She could feel him, down in the great hall, surrounded, his strength flagging as he fought off the empowered wolves. "You don't understand what you are, child," Julian Blackwood sneered, clutching the obsidian disc of the queen's seal. "You think you're a fated mate? You think this is a fairy tale? Look at the inscriptions on the wall behind you." Elara's gaze flickered to the ancient basalt pillars. They were covered in a script that seemed to writhe like smoke. "The prophecy of the Queen of Shadow isn't about love, Elara," Julian whispered, his eyes filled with a terrifying pity. "It's about a conduit. The Vampire King is too powerful to be killed by silver or sun. He can only be destroyed from the inside, by the one person whose soul is anchored to his. Your sisters didn't sell you because they hated you. They sold you because they knew you were the only weapon capable of draining Caspian's immortality." The world seemed to tilt. The betrayal she had felt in the clearing was a paper cut compared to this. "You're lying." "Am I? Why do you think you feel his strength? Why do you think you can handle nightfall?" Julian pointed to the dragon bone dagger in her hand. "The blade is drinking from him through you. Every time you feel empowered by the bond, you are actually siphoning his life force. Your sisters aren't just invaders, Elara. They are the audience for the greatest assassination in history. They didn't want the gold. They wanted you to accidentally kill the king by simply loving him." The revelation shattered the very foundation of Elara's reality. She looked down at her hands. The golden glow of the tether wasn't a gift. It was a straw, and she was the one drinking Caspian dry. That was why he looked so haggard in the bedchamber. That was why the mountain's defenses were failing. His magic was being bled out into her. "If I stay with him, he dies," Elara breathed, the air leaving her lungs. "If I leave him, the wolves kill him." "Precisely," Julian said, stepping toward the manual override lever. "But if you give me the dagger and let the sunshield drop, I can ensure a quick death for him. No more suffering. No more slow drain." A massive tremor shook the citadel. Below them, a section of the floor collapsed, and through the gap Elara saw Caspian. He was on one knee in the courtyard, surrounded by a dozen wolves. Lyra stood over him, her claws raised. Caspian looked up, his eyes finding Elara's through the layers of stone and smoke. He didn't look at her with fear. He looked at her with an absolute, devastating devotion, even as he felt his own power slipping away into her soul. "He knows," Elara whispered, tears blurring her vision. "He knows the bond is killing him and he doesn't care." "He's a fool," Julian snapped. "Now give me the seal." Elara looked at the dagger, then at the rising sun, and finally at the man she was destined to destroy. The stakes weren't just about a war. They were about a love that was inherently toxic to the one she cherished. "I'm not a weapon," Elara said, her voice cracking but firm. She didn't give Julian the dagger. Instead she drove it into her own palm. As her blood, vibrant, human, and laced with the king's stolen magic, hit the floor, the solar chamber erupted in a blinding flash of violet light. The tether didn't snap, it reversed. She wasn't just a conduit for his power. She realized she could be a reservoir for his pain. You want the queen? Ilara screamed, her eyes flashing with a sudden terrifying crimson light that matched Caspian's. Then watch what happens when the queen fights back. With a burst of speed she didn't know she possessed, she tackled Julian, the queen's seal flying from his hand. But as she reached for it, the doors to the chamber burst open. Lyra and Katniss were there, their faces twisted in triumph, holding a canister of liquid noon, a chemical weapon designed to simulate the sun's rays. The revelation is over, Ilara, Lyra growled, her voice distorted by the serum. Now it's time for the darkest hour. The canisters of liquid noon hit the marble floor with a hollow metallic clang that sounded like a funeral bell. Before Ilara could reach for the queen's seal, the glass shattered and a blinding, artificial radiance erupted. It wasn't true sunlight, but to a vampire, and to the woman now bound to one's soul, it was agony. No! Ilara screamed, shielding her eyes as the searing white light flooded the solar chamber. The effect on the fated mate bond was instantaneous and catastrophic. Through the golden tether, Ilara felt a jagged tearing sensation, as if her very spirit were being ripped in two. Down in the courtyard she heard a roar of pure, unadulterated pain. Caspian. The liquid noon was reacting to his magic, turning his own immortality into a furnace that burned him from the inside out. It's over, Ilara, Lyra shouted over the hiss of the chemical fog. She stepped through the light, her skin shimmering with the protection of the Ascension serum. The king is a husk. The mountain is ours. And you're going back into the cage we built for you. Katniss moved with cold, mechanical precision, kicking the queen's seal over the edge of the broken balcony. Ilara watched in horror as the obsidian disc, the only key to the mountain's physical shields, vanished into the smoke and debris of the lower levels. Dimitri. Serafina. Ilara choked out, but there was no answer. The communication channels of the night guard had gone silent. The artificial sun had jammed their senses, leaving the defenders of the citadel blind and burning. Ilara tried to stand, but her legs gave way. The conduit Julian had described was now a double-edged sword. She was feeling every second of Caspian's torture. Her skin felt like it was bubbling and her heart rhythm was faltering, skipping beats as his own heart struggled to pump against the chemical poison. You look so small, Katniss remarked, standing over her with a silver-weighted net. All that talk of being a queen and here you are, bleeding on the floor just like the day we sold you. Why? Ilara gasped, her fingers clawing at the stone. We were sisters. Sisters share a legacy, Ilara. Lyra spat, kneeling down to grip Ilara's hair, forcing her to look at the destruction below. You were a mutation. A human fluke in a line of warriors. We didn't sell you for gold. We sold you because your existence was an insult to our bloodline. And now your mate will die thinking you were the one who led us to his throat. The despair was a physical weight heavier than the silver shackles. Ilara looked out over the balcony. The courtyard was a graveyard of obsidian armor and gray ash. She saw Caspian slumped against a pillar, his once magnificent wings tattered, his eyes closed. He looked small. He looked defeated. The separation was worse than the pain. The golden tether, once a vibrant cord of light, was fraying, turning a dull, sickly gray. She could no longer feel his defiance, only his fading pulse. He was giving up, letting the darkness take him so that the bond wouldn't drag her down into the abyss with him. He's dying to save me, Ilara realized, a sob breaking from her chest. He's dying because he's weak, Lyra corrected, signaling the Shadow Gully wolves to move in for the final kill. And you're coming with us. We have a buyer in the Southern Isles who pays well for broken queens. As the silver net descended over her, Ilara felt the last flicker of hope die. The sun was rising, the real sun, and its light was catching the edges of the mountain. In minutes, the liquid noon would merge with the dawn, and there would be nothing left of the vampire king or his fated mate but stories told to scare children in the dark. She was alone. Betrayed by her blood, rejected by her past, and about to watch her future burn. The darkness wasn't just in the room, it was in her soul. The silver net felt like a web of ice, constricting Ilara's breathing as Lyra and Katniss began to drag her toward the ruined archway. Outside, the first true sliver of the sun peeked over the horizon, its natural rays mingling with the sickly green glow of the liquid noon. The citadel groaned, its ancient stone heart finally giving way to the heat. "Look at him, Elara," Lyra sneered, pointing down at the courtyard where the wolves were closing in on Caspian's slumped form. "Your king is nothing but ash waiting to happen." Elara's vision blurred. The despair was a suffocating ocean, but deep beneath the grief, a spark of something primal ignited. It wasn't the stolen magic of a vampire or the serum-enhanced strength of a wolf. It was the raw, unadulterated fury of a woman who had been sold, hunted, and lied to by the only people she had ever loved. "I am not a weapon," she thought, the words echoing in the hollow chambers of her mind. "And I am not a conduit." As her blood dripped onto the silver netting, the metal hissed. She realized then what Julian and her sisters had overlooked. The fated mate bond wasn't a one-way drain. It was a circle. If she was siphoning his life, she could also pour hers back into him. She didn't need a seal or a throne to be a queen. She needed to claim the monster they had tried to use her to destroy. With a scream of pure defiance, Elara grabbed the silver netting with her bare hands. The metal seared her palms, the smell of scorched flesh filling the air, but she didn't let go. She channeled every ounce of her will, her memories of the quiet library, the smell of rain, and the way Caspian had looked at her like she was the only light in 1,000 years of darkness. The golden tether snapped back into focus, turning from a sickly gray to a brilliant, blinding white. "What are you doing?" Katniss shrieked, raising her crossbow. "Stop her." Elara didn't stop. She pushed her soul through the bond, a tidal wave of human vitality rushing toward the dying king. "Wake up," she screamed into the silence of their shared mind. "Caspian, wake up and take what is yours." In the courtyard below, Caspian's eyes snapped open. They weren't crimson. They were the same brilliant solar gold as the tether. He stood, the liquid noon evaporating off his skin in a cloud of black steam. The wolves recoiled, their predatory instincts screaming at them to run from a god who had just been reborn. "The queen." Caspian's voice didn't just carry. It vibrated through the stone, shaking the very foundations of the solar chamber. "The queen has spoken." A surge of energy erupted from Elara, a shockwave of light that blew the silver net into metallic dust and sent Lyra and Katniss flying backward against the basalt pillars. Elara stood, her burnt hands glowing with a soft, healing radiance. For the first time she wasn't the girl who cried over broken wings. She was the storm that protected them. "You thought I was the weakness?" Elara said, her voice echoing Caspian's power. "I am the anchor. And as long as I stand, this mountain will never fall." Through the smoke, Dmitri Corvin and Serafina Valerius appeared, their obsidian armor glowing with the reflected light of the bond. The Night Guard wasn't defeated. They were waiting for their queen to find her voice. "The seal," Serafina shouted, pointing toward a jagged ledge where the obsidian disc had snagged on a protruding gargoyle. Elara didn't wait. She leapt from the balcony, not as a victim falling but as a predator diving. The wind whipped her hair and for a split second she was weightless. She caught the cold stone of the gargoyle, her fingers locking around the queen's seal. The turning point was complete. She had the key, she had her king, and she had a score to settle. As she climbed back up, the sun fully crested the horizon, but the light didn't burn. It bowed. "The dawn belongs to us now," Elara whispered, the dragonbone dagger Nightfall humming in her hand. Elara slammed the obsidian queen's seal into the central pedestal of the solar chamber with a force that sent a shockwave through the mountain's very marrow. The mountain didn't just groan, it roared. Massive ancient gears, hidden for millennia, shuddered into motion. The reinforced glass of the dome didn't just tint. It polarized, turning the searing, weaponized liquid noon into a soft, harmless violet twilight. "The shields are holding," Serafina Valerius cried out, her emerald eyes reflecting the sudden stabilization of the citadel's magic. But the battle wasn't won. Below in the courtyard, the Shadow Gully wolves were in a frenzy. Driven mad by the Ascension serum and the sudden reversal of their advantage, they lunged at Caspian in a desperate final surge. "Kill him! Kill the king and the girl dies with him!" Lyra screamed, scrambling up from the rubble of the balcony, her face distorted by a mask of primal fury. She lunged at Elara, her claws extended like obsidian daggers. Elara didn't flinch. She felt Caspian's presence in her mind, A calm, icy ocean that stilled her own racing heart. She wasn't fighting alone. Every movement she made was mirrored by him below. She ducked Lyra's swipe, the air whistling past her ear, and drove the hilt of nightfall into her sister's solar plexus. "You never understood strength, Lyra," Elara whispered as her sister gasped for air. "You thought it was about who you could step on. It's about who you're willing to stand for." In the courtyard, Caspian was a whirlwind of shadow and steel. He moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, his wings unfurling like tattered silk banners of war. He didn't just fight the wolves, he dismantled them. With every strike, the golden tether pulsed, feeding him Elara's unwavering resolve. "Dmitri! Now!" Caspian's voice thundered. Dmitri Corvin and the remnants of the Night Guard surged forward, their obsidian blades singing. They were no longer defending a fortress. They were purging an infection. The Shadow Gully wolves, seeing their Alpha Silas vein pinned to a stone pillar by Caspian's own hand, began to break. The invincible army of the sisters was dissolving into a panicked rout. Back in the solar chamber, Katniss leveled her final silver-tipped bolt at Elara's heart. Her hand trembled, the first sign of fear Elara had ever seen from her middle sister. "You're a monster, Elara," Katniss hissed, her finger tightening on the trigger. "You've joined the leeches. You've betrayed your own kind." "I didn't betray my kind," Elara said, stepping toward the crossbow, her chest pressed against the bolt. "I outgrew them." Before Katniss could fire, the floor beneath her erupted. Caspian didn't use the stairs. He had ascended the outside of the tower in a single gravity-defying leap. He shattered the glass of the balcony, landing between Elara and the crossbow. He didn't strike Katniss. He simply looked at her. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his ancient gaze was enough to make her drop the weapon in a clatter of silver and wood. "The debt is paid," Caspian growled, his voice a low vibration that made the stones weep dust. "But the interest is blood." "No," Elara said, placing a hand on Caspian's arm. The golden tether flared, cooling his rage. She looked at Lyra and Katniss, who were now cornered against the basalt pillars, stripped of their serum-fueled bravado. "Killing them is what they would do. It's what they expect." "They sold you, Elara," Caspian reminded her, his eyes still glowing with a dangerous, fading crimson. "They tried to turn your love into a poison. And they failed," Elara said, her voice ringing with the authority of a woman who had finally found her throne. "Let them live. Let them go back to the northern wastes and tell every pack, every king, and every traitor what happens when you touch the Vampire King's mate. Let them live with the knowledge that the sister they threw away is the reason they are still breathing." Lyra looked up, her eyes wide with a mix of hatred and a newfound chilling respect. She realized then that the scullery maid was gone forever. Standing before her was the most powerful entity in the supernatural world. Not because of magic but because of a mercy they could never understand. "Go," Elara commanded. "Before I change my mind." As the sisters fled into the dying smoke of the morning, the citadel fell into a profound, heavy silence. The sun was fully up now, but inside the polarized dome, the light was a gentle, protective embrace. Caspian turned to Elara. The war was over, the mystery of the conduit was solved, and the traitors were gone. He reached out, his thumb grazing the healing burns on her palms. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't shown in centuries. "You reversed the bond. You gave me your light when I was nothing but shadow." "We are the circle, Caspian," Elara replied, leaning her forehead against his cool, marble-hard chest. "The light and the shadow. The king and the queen." The silence that followed the battle was not empty. It was heavy with the scent of pine, ozone, and the promise of a new era. As the violet-tinted sunlight bathed the solar chamber, Elara stood at the balcony's edge, looking out over the mountain pass. The remnants of the Shadow Gully pack were nothing but fading dust on the horizon, and the silver moon banners were being gathered and burned in the courtyard below by Dmitri Corvin and his soldiers. Caspian stepped up behind her, his presence a cooling shadow that chased away the lingering heat of the battle. He didn't reach for her with the possessiveness of a king, but with the reverence of a man who had found his soul. When his arms wrapped around her waist, the golden tether between them didn't hum with a frantic warning anymore. It sang with a steady, harmonious resonance. "The mountain is quiet," Caspian murmured, his chin resting on her shoulder. For the first time in 300 years, the walls don't feel like a fortress. They feel like a home. It cost us a lot to get here, Elara replied, leaning back into him. She looked down at her hands. The burns from the silver net were now silver-white scars, elegant tracings that reminded her of the strength she had claimed. My sisters. They're gone. The only family I knew is a ghost now. Family isn't just a matter of blood, Elara Stacy, Caspian said, using the name she had reclaimed with such ferocity. He turned her to face him, his eyes now a soft, clear amber, the color of a sunset rather than a bloodbath. Look down there. In the courtyard, Serafina Valerius was directing the restoration of the sunshield anchors, working side by side with human refugees who had been liberated from the Shadow Gully camps. There was no fear in their eyes as they looked up at the citadel, only a profound, quiet hope. They weren't looking at a tyrant. They were looking at the queen who had spared her enemies and saved their sanctuary. You've changed the rules of the game, Caspian continued, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. The world expected a war of extinction. You gave them a lesson in mercy. You are the heartbeat of this kingdom, Elara. Not because you're my mate, but because of who you chose to be when the world tried to break you. Elara felt a tear prick her eye, but it wasn't one of grief. It was fulfillment. The girl who had once spent her nights mending tunics and wishing for a seat at the table was now the one setting the table for an entire nation. She had lost her sisters, but she had gained a people. She had lost her past, but she had secured a future. What happens now? She asked, a small, genuine smile tugging at her lips. Now, Caspian whispered, his lips inches from hers, we rebuild. We turn the citadel of cinders into a city of light. And we ensure that no girl is ever sold to the darkness again. As they shared a kiss that tasted of winter cedar and the sweetness of a new dawn, the golden tether flared one last time, weaving their spirits together so tightly that not even time could unpick them. The prophecy of the Queen of Shadow had been fulfilled, but not in the way the traitors intended. She wasn't the weapon that destroyed the king. She was the light that made him immortal in a way blood never could. I hope you all felt the raw emotion of Elara's journey today. From the cold betrayal of her sisters to the fiery realization of her true power, her story is a reminder that our value isn't determined by those who throw us away, but by the strength we find when we stand our ground. What did you think of Elara's choice to show mercy to her sisters? Would you have done the same, or did they deserve a darker fate? Let me know in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a chapter of our supernatural sagas. We have so many more secrets to uncover in the coming weeks. Thank you for being part of our community. Wherever you are in the world, remember that you are the author of your own destiny. Until next time, keep your hearts brave and your shadows long.